World War II ended with the detonation of the two most powerful weapons the world had ever seen, nuclear bombs. The end of the war didn't bring peace, however. Instead, tensions between the US and the Soviet Union were brought to the forefront. These tensions had been building for a long time. The date often given to the start of the Cold War was the Yalta Conference. Although the US and the Soviet Union were technically allies during World War II, their friendship was fake at best. The radically different theories on economics and government led them to deeply distrust one another and led then-President Franklin Roosevelt and then-Soviet leader Joseph Stalin to lock horns over the future of Europe. Truman's Marshall Plan supplied billions of US dollars to help Europe rebuild and prevent communism from taking root. This was part of a strategy called containment, or preventing the spread of communism across the world. Tensions escalated further when the US joined European nations in forming NATO, a military alliance. The Soviet Union responded with the Warsaw Pact, and the world seemed on the brink of World War III. It was around this time that the phrase Iron Curtain came into being, which referred to how the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe had cut themselves off from the rest of the world. In fact, all most Americans really knew about the Soviet Union was that they had atomic bombs and they didn't like Americans. The two couldn't just simply go to war, however. This was mostly because, at heart, leaders in both countries were rational. They realized that a nuclear war would spell the end of the world. As a result, Cold War armed conflict took place in a smaller scale in other areas of the world. The three major U.S. military involvements took place in Vietnam, which ended in defeat after a painfully long and unpopular war, Korea, which didn't really end, just both sides agreed to stop fighting for a while, which means North Korea is still a Cold War threat, and Cuba, which for obvious reasons was of great concern to the U.S. Shortly after communist forces took control of Cuba, President Kennedy ordered its invasion at the Bay of Pigs. The mission was an immediate and embarrassing failure. The Soviet Union responded by constructing a wall between East Berlin, which was under Soviet control, and West Berlin, which was free, as retaliation for American arrogance. JFK's problems in Cuba weren't over, however. The natural alliance between Cuba and the USSR resulted in the Soviets placing nuclear missiles in Cuba, where they could reach the US within seconds. JFK, naturally, asked the Soviets to please remove them. Soviet leader Khrushchev declined. The two stared each other down until finally Khrushchev yielded. The missiles were removed from Cuba, and an embarrassed Communist Party removed Khrushchev from power. The affair did, however, lead to the Red Phone between the two governments. Around the time this was going on, the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the first man-made satellite in space. Kennedy was quick to respond.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
The so-called space race was on, and on July 20th, 1969, the U.S. won as Neil Armstrong became the first human being to walk on the moon. One final thing to know about the Cold War was how it affected American citizens. In addition to the constant threat of being incinerated by nuclear attack, there was also the fear of communist infiltration. Basically, people were seeing red everywhere, which I shall now try to demonstrate by adjusting the white balance. Joseph McCarthy, a U.S. senator, capitalized on this fear and began accusing various political and military figures of being communists, often falsely. So how did it all end? Well, it turned out that communism, especially the way the Soviets were doing it, is a pretty terrible system. By the late 1980s, the Soviet economy was pretty clearly in the tank, and its political structure was falling apart. Mikhail Gorbachev came into power and started a reform movement that led to this at the Berlin Wall.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
As well as the collapse of the Soviet Union and the return of the white balance to normal. The largest part became the country we know today as Russia, while the rest was divided into independent nations. And that's how the Cold War happened.